Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the report that Boris Johnson may have dropped out of the Tory leadership contest because he'd been told it could cost him £10 million a year if it went wrong. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So throughout all the scandals when Johnson was Prime Minister, I did keep saying that when he eventually left office, it would be to a golden future. The potential earnings for a Prime Minister are fairly substantial, and for particularly interesting Prime Ministers, huge. Boris Johnson is a politician who courts controversy. It really, shouldn't take very much of a critical eye to see that he talks absolute rubbish, but he has the knack for getting people to believe his twaddle. Take his latest nonsense about wanting to defend his legacy of the 2019 manifesto, support for Ukraine, COP26, for example. Okay, so he's turned up to COP27 and he's given a speech, which in itself, is fine. It's great. Thank you very much. He's attacking climate change deniers, which must include a veiled rebuke of the very MPs who supported him in becoming Prime Minister in the first place. But his motivation was purely to keep himself relevant, keep feeding the controversy that surrounds him. How can we tell? Because what has he done exactly to defend his so-called legacy? Ever since announcing his resignation as Prime Minister, never mind standing down, ever since announcing his resignation, he's been on a series of holidays, months on end. Holidays followed by parties, followed by more holidays, followed by more parties. He's partied throughout the summer while the leadership contest was on. As soon as Truss was installed, off he buggered on holiday. He came back to Parliament for one day so that he could talk about himself when the Queen died. But that's it. Parliament's been in session for quite a few weeks since the summer recess ended, but Johnson hasn't been in attendance. He's still an MP. He's still drawing his salary for being an MP. But he is not to be seen either in the House of Commons nor his own constituency. Now he's just partying and holidaying. The idea that this man is continuing public service in the role of legacy defender is objectively ridiculous. He's in it for the glory and the money. And the money will be all important. According to the record of members' interest, Johnson has accepted 50 grand's worth of free accommodation for these jollies from a single Tory donor. 50 grand. Some parts of the country you can get a house for that. But I imagine the days of getting Tory donors to pay for his life of luxury may wane somewhat in the future. If he wants to carry on a life of idle opulence, he needs to start raking in his own cash. According to a report, Boris Johnson is said to have an earning potential of about £20 million a year. He's not bad work for talking crap, whether in memoirs or on the speech circuit. But the same report suggested that Johnson had been warned that if he entered the contest and lost, that it would hit his reputation and basically halve his earnings. Now, if that's true, you can see how it might have made Johnson balk. Do you really want to have another shot at being leader and cost yourself £10 million a year? Tricky decision. Tricky decision. I mean, I'll remind people that we do now know that Johnson actually did get the nominations needed. This is like a story in three parts. The first part was Johnson backing out of the contest, and it's like, is that because you didn't get the nominations? I think it's because you didn't get the nominations. But then it surprised the hell out of me. The chair of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, actually confirmed recently Johnson did have the support needed to trigger a ballot with members. So that was the second part, the fact that actually he did have the nomination. So why didn't he stand then? I'm quite sure a lot of pressure was put on him to withdraw, absolutely. But it would have been put on him to withdraw before he ever came back to the country. So it was genuinely his decision. It was Boris Johnson's actual decision not to go forward with the contest. So what caused that decision? Pressure from MPs? Well, he knew they were against him anyway. But telling him that he could negatively harm his earning potential by losing the contest, now that's much more believable. But whatever the reason, he can claim he would have won and he chose not to for altruistic reasons. And being fair, it may not even have been just the prospect of losing the contest. It was widely believed that party members would pick Johnson over Sunak. But are we really certain? What if some of the Tory party members who backed Truss were chastened by what followed? What if support for Sunak had actually grown amongst members? And it's no easy task to accurately poll party members. All the polls we saw, by the way, were coming from Johnson supporters and Sunak supporters. We don't know they were reliable. The polling of the leadership contest carried a much larger margin for error than when polling for the general population, due to the difficulty in getting reliable representative samples. What if Sunak won? Johnson rejected by his own MPs and then rejected by his own party. Yes, you can see how that would somewhat take the lustre off his legend. So maybe the safe option was to leave his mess for others to clear up and rake in the millions by saying how awesome things would be if only he'd still been in charge. But it did get me to thinking, even if Johnson was confident that he'd win, would it have helped him to take the job on again anyway? I mean, forget about the Privileges Committee investigation for now. We don't know what will happen there. But as Prime Minister, he'd have to defer all those earnings for a start until he left office. So all that 20 million quid a year, that's not really applying while he's still Prime Minister. There's lots of things he can't do. So he'd be deferring that for at least a couple more years. Well, that's 40 million quid up the Swannish for a start off, isn't it? But what would happen over the next 2 years? He'd be presiding over a lengthy recession. He'd be facing party infighting over everything from budgets to environmental policies. And then at the end of it all, he'd head into a general election that he's likely to lose. Now, Johnson earns his respect from the jackals who follow him because he's seen as an election-winning machine. As both London Mayor and then Prime Minister, he was just seen as someone who would just win elections, from nothing. And they were from nothing. The Conservatives really, if you looked at it on paper, shouldn't have been winning in 2019. But the problem was, of course, it's not enough for the government to look ropey. People have to believe that the credible opposition is a better alternative. But people thought it was essentially down to Johnson. And certainly he had the personality to carry out the strategy. But there are some who thought he'd win the next general election as well, as if he can't lose elections. He built up this legend that he just wins and wins and wins. So, yes, it would absolutely crush his reputation if it had to be pointed out that as soon as he was up against a robust alternative that appealed to voters, he would lose. And he wouldn't be able to blame anyone else. He'd have been Prime Minister for 5 years. He'd have decided policy on everything from Brexit to COVID to climate change. It would be his election to own. I'm sure he'd still be able to pull in what would be serious money for most of us. Still a former Prime Minister. But hardly the £20 million a year he might be on for now. That's more the sort of money for Prime Ministers who can claim some great achievements. Which means Prime Ministers who either have great achievements to their name or those who cut and run before their chickens came home to roost. Mind you, Johnson denies that it was financial considerations that led him to pulling out. He claims it was right to not try and lead a disunited party. That was it. Problem with that explanation is that it doesn't explain why he left his holiday to haul his carcass over here to get the ball rolling in the first place. For several days he was in the leadership contest. He was trying to gather the nominations. Nothing new came to light in those last few days. When he was trying to gather support, nothing new came to light. It was known that Johnson didn't have the backing of a majority of MPs. That's why he fell in the first place. It was known that most preferred Sunak over any other potential leader presented to them. That's why they made the contest require 100 nominations, because people thought that Sunak was the only one who could definitely get 100 nominations. If they'd have thought that Johnson would have got to 100, they'd have made it 150. All of it was known before Johnson winched himself up from his hammock in the Caribbean. Now, I don't, in all honesty, know why he even put on a show of entering the contest. It wouldn't surprise me, actually, now, after everything. It wouldn't surprise me to hear that he never intended to enter in the first place. I could absolutely believe that it was all a sham from the start. That he took his supporters for a ride. He came to the UK just to drum up the nominations needed, just so he could say that he would have been able to become Prime Minister again, to prove that he still had that support, and then leave them all with the mess he made while he goes off to earn 20 million quid a year. He's got expensive taste, you see. You know, the blonde buffoon, very expensive taste. And although he is rich by most of our standards, he's not rich enough to support his preferred lifestyle. Like I say, once the freebies from Tory donors start to run dry, he'll need to fall back on his own money or downgrade his standard of living. So yes, I can well see how the prospect of losing the contest costing him £10 million a year would have made a big difference to Johnson's calculations. But there we are anyway. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.